I have always found that homegrown tomatoes are much better than anything I could buy, and they are even better if an excellent variety is grown really well. There is definitely room to improve the methods that I use and the attention that I give these plants, but I always felt that there were probably better varieties that I could grow. So last year I grew 54 different varieties of tomatoes in the larger polytunnel, which was definitely too many to keep track of and evaluate, and I selected 23 of these varieties to grow again this year, plus 3 that I wasn't able to fit into the trial, and another 2 varieties that a friend gave to me. So after a second trial of 28 varieties this year, with healthier plants growing in better conditions, I feel that I have a better sense of which varieties I would definitely grow again and which ones I would drop to narrow down the field. And I was also quite surprised by a few varieties and disappointed with the results of others. And I also learned a fair amount about the different growth habits of the different varieties, and that some varieties may produce better if they were grown with different methods. The trial this season was a lot more successful than last year and a lot more productive, with an average of about 3.4 kilograms of tomatoes harvested from each plant, more than twice what I was able to harvest last year. Part of this was because I spaced the plants 50 centimeters apart in the row, rather than the 33 centimeter spacing that I used last year, giving all the plants more space, which would lead to less competition. But even with fewer plants, the overall yield this season was 8.3 kilograms per square meter, compared to just 4.7 kilograms per square meter last year in the same polytunnel, which is a significant difference in the amount of tomatoes that we were able to harvest. A lot of this is because I dropped many of the less productive varieties that I grew last year, focusing on growing the varieties that produce more tomatoes in this context. I also avoided the competition that the tomato plants suffered last year when they were intercropped beside late spring crops, and this year the plants struggled less to get established after transplanting. And it seemed to be a warmer growing season overall, and I think we were more successful in caring for the plants, though there is always room for improvement. I grew 3 plants of most of the varieties, but I think it's easier to compare the average harvest per plant, and there is still quite a range of productivity between the varieties. And comparing the harvest from the same varieties grown last year, most of the varieties produced significantly more this year, which is what I would have expected, but I was surprised that a number of them had quite similar harvests, with a few actually doing worse this year despite the extra space and better general growing conditions. So something else is going on here, and I'm not really sure what has caused this, but it does point to the general changes that occur from season to season, possible variations in soil fertility, and the limitations of growing only a few plants of each variety, which is a definite issue with variety trials like this. Last year, only 2 of the 54 varieties produced more than 3 kilograms per plant, and this year 19 of the 28 varieties passed this threshold, which is a significant improvement. But as with last year, I would be hesitant to dismiss some varieties or grow others simply on the basis of yield, as there are other factors to consider, starting with the fact that we use tomatoes for different purposes, often based on their size. Sorting the range of tomatoes into 4 broad categories based on their general size and possible uses, 3 of the varieties produced huge tomatoes, 7 produced large beefsteak type tomatoes, another 7 I would classify as medium size, and 11 produced small or cherry types of tomatoes. I think I would want to grow at least one variety from each of these categories, but there are reasons to grow others from each category, especially for the flavor. Some varieties produce ripe tomatoes significantly earlier in the summer, others produce continually over a longer growing season, and others produced a lot of tomatoes over a relatively short season, all of which can be really useful depending on the context. Some of the varieties grew very vigorously, which were usually varieties that produced over a longer season, and they needed extra work to manage this continual growth of the plants that easily exceeded the height of the polytunnel. Other varieties were quite a bit shorter and less vigorous, but in some cases really productive, with the plants seeming to naturally prioritize the production of fruit rather than leaves, and other types were in between the two. Mixing plants with significantly different growth habits caused some problems in the polytunnel, and I would want to select different varieties based on the height of the growing space or how I plan to manage the plants, or at least to group varieties with similar growth habits together. The time taken to manage these different plants is a factor, but perhaps not nearly as important as the time it takes to harvest, with the largest varieties obviously being much quicker to pick than the smaller varieties. but even some of the small ones were a lot more time consuming to harvest than the others. And the tomatoes of some varieties seemed to split so easily, which definitely reduced the usable yield, making the timing of harvesting much more important, and in some cases were difficult to transport even short distances and needed to be eaten right away. But the importance of this factor, as with all the others, really depends on the overall purpose or context in which I'm growing the tomatoes, and it was a combination of all of these factors that I've tried to evaluate in determining whether to continue to grow a variety or not. The 3 varieties that produce the largest fruit also produce the largest yields, and most of the tomatoes ripened in a relatively short period of time and are perhaps more suitable for cooking or preserving. The Ilsa variety was one of the plants that I got from a friend, and although it was planted later, this one plant produced a very big yield of really large but quite watery fruit really early in the season, and then stopped producing anything. It did not seem to be a very robust plant and suffered from deficiencies later in the season, but as there was only one of these plants, it is difficult to really understand what was going on. The Belarusian heart is one out of the 3 varieties that seem to be bred specifically for cooking, but all 3 plants developed significant deficiencies in the leaves. The Fio de Rio Gordo was the largest yield overall of quite tasty fruit, and it was a medium-sized plant that seemed to be quite healthy compared to the other 2 varieties. If I wanted to only grow one of the 3, I would probably pick the Fio de Rio Gordo. But if the main aim was to produce a tomato sauce, it would be good to cook a sample of each to see what kind of quality or quantity of sauce they produced. But with all 3 varieties, I think I would grow them for just the main first part of the harvest, cutting off the main leader and the later flower clusters to encourage all the plants to focus on the existing tomatoes, and then to remove the plants in late August or early September to open up the space in the polytunnel for other late season crops. Of the 7 varieties that produced large beefsteak type tomatoes, deciding which ones to grow again was a bit easier. The Melka variety was the other one that I got one plant from a friend, and although it is not ideal to make a decision based on one plant, we really like the flavor of this yellow or light orange tomato, and it produced a lot of them. The Brandywine is often referred to as one of the tastiest tomatoes, and I definitely agree with that, and I was pleased that it was also really productive this year, even if the fruit were not so uniform. I would definitely want to grow both of these varieties again, but I would also be hesitant to drop most of the other ones, even if they didn't produce as much. I really like the flavor of the Saint-Pierre tomatoes, which were fairly short and robust plants that kept producing for most of the season. The black Krim tomatoes were an interesting darker color and were very tasty, especially cooked. And the Russian Emerald apple variety produced very interesting and tasty green tomatoes. But the plants of both of these varieties were not so robust and struggled with deficiencies, but they did produce a lot of fruit earlier in the season. I had accidentally cut off the tops of 2 of the Baron Rose plants early in the season, and although the plants continued to grow from one of the side shoots, this setback would partially explain the lower yield of these quite nice tomatoes. It would be hard to select which of these 4 varieties to grow again, or which ones to drop, as they're all quite different and valuable to grow simply for diversity, but I would probably drop the Paul Robeson variety. Although these tomatoes were quite nice, the plants struggled, and 2 of them stopped the development of the main growing tip halfway through the season, something that happened to only one other plant in the whole polytunnel. I'm not sure why this variety struggled, but I probably won't grow it again, especially as there are better options. So I would pick 2 out of the set if I really needed to cut back on varieties that I grew, but if I had the space, I would be tempted to grow the other 4 for the sake of diversity, flavor, and color. And all of these plants are quite small and did not really need to be dropped or rehung, so they would be easier to grow them side by side. The 7 varieties that produce medium-sized fruit also had a wide diversity of color, as well as a greater diversity in their growth habit, when the tomatoes ripened, their flavor, and their possible uses. The Lotus variety produced an abundance of very unusual colored fruit over a long part of the growing season, and the plants were quite vigorous and required more time and effort to manage them. And the Jens tangerine variety was a similar type of plant, but a very different color, and the fruit had a tendency to split, making them less useful. And even though these 2 varieties were very productive and beautiful, I was not so fond of the flavor of the tomatoes they produced, and didn't find them very useful. The old flame tomatoes were possibly the tastiest out of the set and a bit larger, and still produced a fair amount to harvest over a fairly long part of the growing season, even though the plants were not very robust or healthy. The Bloody Butcher plants were also smaller plants that were not so robust or healthy, but produced very tasty tomatoes earlier in the season than any of the other varieties, which makes them definitely worth growing again. The Dorenia variety was a very vigorous variety, producing large trusses of quite uniform fruit that seemed to keep reasonably well, which makes them easier to harvest and transport, and perhaps very useful for growing to sell. Unfortunately, they were not as good for eating fresh, but I did find that these less juicy but uniform tomatoes were quite useful for dehydrating, and I would be interested in growing this variety again, mainly to produce dried or semi-dried tomatoes for storage. The Garbacho Negro tomatoes were not very tasty, though they might make a good sauce, and the green zebra tomatoes were better tasting and were a very interesting novel variety, but as both of them were quite low yielding, I probably won't grow them again. So out of the 7 medium-sized varieties, I would probably grow 2 of them for flavor and 1 of them for dehydrating, and interestingly, I would probably not grow the 2 more vigorous and productive varieties again, or the green variety, unless I was really looking for diversity of color and taste. The small fruited varieties offered the most diverse range of sizes, colors, and shapes, and also the widest range of yields. The pollen variety produced the biggest harvest of small yellow tomatoes that were produced on huge quantities on very large trusses. But the large, tangled trusses made harvesting a lot more difficult and time-consuming, and the skin of a lot of the tomatoes were damaged in the process, which meant that they needed to be eaten right away, so I'm not sure I would grow them again. The next 2 best producing varieties were really similar, with both of them producing similar yields of traditional cherry tomato size and color on large trusses and vigorous plants that produced for a long part of the growing season. I've grown the very common Gardener's Delight variety for years, but the Farad variety almost seemed like the same variety, but a few of us think that it tastes a little bit better, so I might pick it over the other one. The Christmas Grapes variety is slightly different, and the Chadwick Cherry variety is a bit bigger, but they are both subtle variations of the small red tomato, and they don't produce as much as the others, so I don't think they are really worth growing again. The Tomato Berry Garden is one of the 3 hybrid varieties that I grew, and it did produce a reasonable yield of quite unusual shaped fruit, which could make them ideal for sale and would probably transport quite well. But that is not really the context that I'm growing in, and the tomatoes were quite dry and not overly tasty, and I think I would only grow them again if I was looking for the diversity of shape and quality. I would place another hybrid variety called Modus in the same category, though it produced significantly less. The brown berry tomatoes were an interesting darker color, but poor yielding. The sweetie tomatoes were tiny and tasty, but most of them split before I could harvest them. And the Zentare Lasite variety had unusual fruit that also split, and given that both of them had really poor yields, I won't grow them again. The Sun Gold hybrid variety was the most disappointing in the whole trial, producing the lowest yields, significantly less than they did last year, which indicates that something was wrong this year. Although the plants started out okay, the fruit became very small later in the season, and I think I would want to try to grow this variety again, especially as the tomatoes are possibly tastier than all the other small tomato varieties that I grew. So, if I really wanted to cut back on the number of varieties of tomatoes that I grew each year, I would probably still grow 7 of them. I would grow the really big Fio de Rio Gordo variety for making tomato sauce, and I would prune back the plants quite a bit to focus on the first large batch of fruit, then remove the plants to make space for the other crops. I would grow the Milka and Brandywine variety for beefsteak tomatoes, the Bloody Butcher variety for an early crop, and the Old Flame variety for a longer season general purpose tomato. All 4 are really tasty and relatively short plants that wouldn't need to be rehung or dropped during the season, and would likely grow well together in the same bed. I would grow the Dorenia variety specifically for dehydrating, though they can be really useful for other purposes, and I would also grow the Farad variety for the very useful and tasty cherry tomatoes. Both of these varieties are very vigorous plants that grow and produce over a long season, so would need to be restrung or dropped regularly, and would probably be best grown in a separate area than the other 5 varieties. But I'm not so sure that I would want to reduce the number of varieties that much next year, and for various reasons I could easily expand the list to 21 varieties, only dropping 7 of the varieties that I tried this year. I really like the idea of growing a wide diversity of different tomatoes, and I would love to explore growing more of the many other varieties that are out there. But each additional variety that I add to the list takes more time and effort, especially if I'm going to continue to weigh and record what I harvest from each of the varieties and to keep track of everything. If I had only grown the 7 preferred varieties, the average yield this year could have been 4.4 kilograms per plant, which is significantly more than the average of 3.4 kilograms that was produced. But as with many things, there is a balance there somewhere, and I suspect that next year I will prioritize most of the polytunnel space to growing the preferred varieties, but I'll probably also grow some of the other varieties and try a few new ones as well, continuing the cycle of exploration even if I don't put in all the effort to do a full variety trial again.